My name is Heather Abramson. I'm part of the Jewish community of Brisbane, and I'm here to tell the story of my German side of my family, my dad's family. The title is called The Nazis, the Jewish Holocaust and My Family, because we were certainly caught up in it and we lost members of our family. So I'm here to share that with you. The photo on the front page is a photo of my grandmother, Elise Moses, she was called before she married my grandfather, and then she became Elise Feuerstein, which means Firestone in English. She was born in 1884 in Dresden, and my grandfather was born in about 1880, I think it was. I want to share with you a quote that I found in a fascinating book written by a young Australian author. Her name is Catherine Braybon, and the book that she wrote about was actually about disappeared people in Stalin's Russia. However, the whole theme about people who just disappear with no record of where they went is totally relevant to me and my family. I wondered about the consequences of inadequate mourning. I wondered if the dead found other ways to remind us of their presence. Plagued by uncertainty of loss, the lack of a gravestone, perhaps there would be a sense of disquiet, nauseas of the mind, deep depressions, all as manifestations in the living of the mute presence of the dead, knocking without hands, calls without mouths. And that feels very real to me. So this is my grandmother, Elise, with my dad, baby Franz Feuerstein, born in 1909. This is my father, Franz, with his little sister, Suzanne, who was born in 1913. Suzanne was known as Suse to the Feuerstein family. It's sort of like in English, Suzanne and Susie, but she was referred to by the family as Suse. From 1914 to 1918, my grandfather, Leon Firestone, fought in World War I for Kaiser Wilhelm, and this was his Iron Cross Medal for valour on the battlefield. His job was to wheel a big mobile cannon and fire the cannon at the enemy in the heat of battle. This is my grandfather, my grandmother, and my dad's younger brother, who was born in 1916, I think it was. And this was taken in 1931. His name is Gerhard. My father referred to him as Gerd, and later on we called him Jack. This is my grandparents in 1935, Leon and Elise Feuerstein. On Krystallnacht, which was November 9th, 1938, things got very, very bad for the Jews of Germany. Things had already been getting bad under Hitler. There were all kinds of restrictions put on Jewish life. I think it was 1934, they were no longer considered citizens. But on Krystallnacht, there was this massive event of violence against Jews and Jewish businesses. My father was very, very badly beaten up on that night and arrested. It was the first really violent pogrom that the Nazis held against the Jewish people. Jewish businesses were destroyed, synagogues across Germany were attacked and burned, including the famous and beautiful Dresden synagogue. Jews were murdered, Jewish women were raped, 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up, beaten and imprisoned. As I said, Dad was one of them. They were then incarcerated in concentration camps, and Dad was sent to Buchenwald. Buchenwald was just a very cold, at that time, very cold place with timber huts. It was midwinter. They had one thin blanket each, and they were crammed into wooden huts. My dad was only in Buchenwald for about 6 weeks. And the reason that he was released was that the Nazis wanted to take over the family factory, and they had employed a member of the Nazi party from Dresden to run the factory, but he was a butcher and he had absolutely no idea about printing and embossing, which is what the factory did. The factory was called, well, in English, Firestone embossed show cards. Show cards were a very popular form of advertising in the early 20th century, right through to the mid-20th century. So the factory made embossed show cards, which were a very popular form of advertising in the early 20th century. My great-grandfather actually developed the whole process of embossing, which is to turn something into, instead of a flat picture, something where part of the picture is embossed, that is made into a three-dimensional image. And it was very popular at that time. And at that time, the factory were exporting all over the world, as well as making embossed show cards for Germany. So the man that the Nazis put in charge of the factory was a butcher, and he had no idea. So the factory was very quickly going broke. They let my dad out of Buchenwald on the condition that he would come and spend 6 months running the factory and getting the business back up and going. And they allowed his younger brother, who hadn't been sent to Buchenwald, to come and help him in the factory. And that was a great help to my dad, because Gerd was very good at the printing and the embossing and just the whole process, whereas, well, Dad was good at all of those things, but he was also good as a manager. So Dad did these pictures. He did a picture each year for Gerd's birthday. So you can see that Gerd's birthday was on the 3rd of September, and the picture on the left is Gerd's birthday, 1938, in Dresden, and then the year after was 3rd of September 1939 in Enfield in England. So how did they get from Dresden to England? Part of the deal that my dad negotiated with the Nazis was that when they had done their 6 months of getting the business back up and running, they would be allowed to leave the country. He and his brother would be allowed to leave the country. And that was accepted by the Nazis. My grandparents were not part of that deal, and my aunt, Suzanne, wasn't part of that deal. And I once asked my dad, why didn't you take your sister with you? And he said, well, my parents thought she would be safer with them. Time would tell that that wasn't actually the case, but there's more to Suzanne's story than I knew about when I was growing up in my parental home. An uncle in Canada paid a bond for the two brothers to enter Holland. Every country around the world that was accepting some Jews at that time, even to pass through the country, had to pay a bond, so that they were showing that they would not be a burden on the community of that country. So Dad and his brother Gerd left Dresden, went to Holland, but really just to pass through Holland, and from there they took a boat to England. And once in England, they actually both got work quite quickly as printers. They found a local family that they were able to board with, bed and board, and that was going very nicely for them. However, Dunkirk came along. After Dunkirk, which was a disaster for the English, Churchill became very nervous about having any Germans or any Italians in his country. So my dad and his brother were rounded up along with a lot of other young Jewish men, and they were interned in a camp, a tent camp, at a place called Huyton, which was actually a racetrack. And Dad said it was very muddy and cold, and they were told that they were going to be deported. And very early in 1940, they were deported. There were several thousand of these young Jewish men, and they were put on 3 different ships. And what the English do so well is you send the people you don't want to the colonies. So 2 of the ships were to go to Canada and 1 to Australia. The interns didn't know where they were going. The first ship was loaded with about 3,000 people, and it was on its way to Canada. It was called the Anandora Star, but it was torpedoed within 24 hours of leaving Liverpool, and many, many lives were lost. The bulk of the young people on that ship died, but there were some refugees who survived it, and they were then put on the next ship, which is the same ship that my dad was put on. They were put on a ship called the Dunera. They weren't told they were coming to Australia, they weren't told anything, but they were told, hand over your valuables and hand over all your papers, and we will take care of them. Yes, well, so they never saw their valuables again, and their paperwork was all thrown into the ocean. The English didn't have too many available sailors at that time because they were at war, and I've been told that the men that they hired to be sailors on the ship were actually people that they released from English prisons in order to do that job. So they were really nice type of person. There were, I think, 2,800 people on the boat. About 2,000 of them were young Jewish men. My dad, at the age of 30, which he was then, was one of the older ones. They were kept in the absolute bow of the boat. They had 20 minutes of air time each per day when they could walk on the deck of the ship. The Dunera itself is quite a famous ship. There's been a film made about it, although Dad said he wasn't very impressed with it because it was such a terrible time for them, and the film is made into a comedy because probably if they'd done it without that comic effect, it wouldn't have been really watchable. The young Jewish men in the bows of the ship had nowhere to shower. They were hosed down with seawater on a daily basis. They had only big cans to use as toilets, which slopped all over the floor. There was not even a hammock for each man. There were enough hammocks for 1/3 of the men. So they took it in turns to sleep, and some of them slept on tables. The food there was no concern at all for Jewish dietary laws. They were fed pork and other things that Jews don't normally eat. It was pretty rough, and they were not allowed to get up and go to the toilet in the night. And one man did get up and go to the tin can in the night, and he had his leg speared with a bayonet, and he spent the rest of the trip in the sick bay. It took about 8 weeks for them to, first they stopped in Perth, and then Melbourne, and then Sydney. And most of them were allowed to leave the boat in Sydney. So this is the Dunera. The ship left Liverpool at midnight. Callously indifferent to the fate of the men, the British government allowed the Dunera only one destroyer escort. This but 8 days after the sinking of the first ship, the Anandora Star. Less than 24 hours out of Liverpool, German submarine boat U-56 attacked. A torpedo hit the Dunera with a loud bang, but did not explode. A second torpedo was fired, recalled Peter Eden 70 years later in an interview with the BBC. The swell was high and the ship rose just as the torpedo went underneath. 60 years after the war, the pilot of that U-boat released his memoirs, and he actually said that they had a third torpedo that they were going to fire, but someone had seen these documents floating in the water with High German written on them. So he had radioed to his home base to say, I think they've got German prisoners of war on this boat. And he was told not to fire the third torpedo. So there were many amazing miracle stories, really, with my dad getting out of Germany. The first place that they were sent to when they got to Australia was Hay, which is outback New South Wales. So for these totally European men and boys, this was a big surprise. It was a very hot desert kind of environment, and nothing could prepare them for the temperatures and just the whole difference of Australia, especially outback Australia, to their fairly lush homes in Europe. However, the young men, I think they were so relieved to be out of Europe, they made the place very happy for themselves. My dad was part of a team that taught the younger ones, and he had some reasonable English. He had studied Latin, Greek and English at university, and so he was also able to teach the young ones some English. And after a year in Hay, some of those teenage guys sat their higher school certificate in Sydney and passed. Dad was also one of the ones who could teach them chemistry and mathematics, and there were others who could teach lots of other subjects. They were not an ignorant bunch. The Jews of Germany had been incredibly well treated up till 1934, and they had been entitled to go to university, which was unheard of in Poland. Well, actually not unheard of, but there were very strict limits of Jews in university in Poland. Germany had been a very, very good place for Jewish people to live. They had, the people who ran the camp would bring them lambs, and they were allowed to slaughter the lambs in the kosher way. They cooked all their own food, they grew vegetables, some of them had musical instruments, they played music. At the back of the mess hall was an old piano. My dad was a very good pianist. He said that the piano was out of tune, but every night after lights out, he would go down to the mess hall and play the piano in the dark. And quite often when he got up from the piano, there'd be a whole bunch of guys sitting there just listening to him. And there were violinists and flautists and all sorts of people. And fortunately, they seem to have been allowed to keep their musical instruments. After about a year in Hay, they were transferred to Tatura, which is in Victoria, and there was a new prison camp built for them there. The temperatures were a bit more bearable for them in Tatura. It's close to Shepparton, but it was still very much an Australian climate, but a lot more comfortable for them than Hay had been. And they did the same things in Tatura as they had been doing in Hay. running classes, growing food, cooking, playing music. And during their time in both Hay and Tatura, quite a few of them wrote letters of protest to the Australian government to protest the fact that they were prisoners of war, when in fact they were refugees who'd been running from the war. And whilst there were mainly German but some Italian Jews in this group, they really were refugees, and they were offended that they were being treated like prisoners of war. Those messages got back to England. England sent out a man from the English army who was also Jewish, who also spoke multiple languages, and he came and he visited them at the camp and asked them lots of questions and saw what they were doing. And after his visit there, he wrote to Churchill and to the Australian government that yes, these guys were refugees, not prisoners of war, and they should be released. And lo and behold, they were released. So it was about a year and a half that they were prisoners of war in Australia. Churchill actually felt guilty afterwards and apologised to them. I don't know exactly when that happened, but he realised he'd made a mistake with these Jewish boys. This is another one of my dad's cards to his brother. They shared a bunk bed, Dad below, Gerd above. And he says, "I wish you all the best for your new year of life, and I hope that we shall be reunited with our dear parents at your next birthday. Your loving brother, Franz." So my dad was Franz, and his brother, as I said, was Gerd. This story is also about my Aunt Suzanne, and she died in 1941. She was born in 1913. She died in 1941 in Germany, and I will tell you more about Suzanne. Suzanne was interned, and I didn't know any of this when my dad was alive. I've been doing a lot of research, and as well as that, after my Uncle Gerd passed away, my brothers had the job of cleaning out his house ready for sale. His children were both in Israel. His daughter did come to Australia and did see him before he died and was part of the clean-up process. But one of the things that they found when they were cleaning out Gerd's house was a big trunk that he had brought. Well, he hadn't actually brought it, I found out recently. It had been sent to Australia by the family that Dad and Gerd boarded with in England. Because I was so confused. How did my dad get some photographs of his family? Some of the little bits and pieces that he had from Germany, I couldn't understand how he'd managed to bring it. And it turns out that when they were told that they were going to be interned, they left, both Dad and Gerd had these trunks, and they left them with the family that they'd been boarding with money, and asked that when they were finally released, if their trunks could be sent by ship to wherever they were. And this wonderful family honoured that and actually sent their trunks to them to Melbourne, Australia, which is where they both ended up. And that is just extraordinary. And one of the things that my brothers found in Uncle Gerd's trunk was a letter that had been sent from my grandparents to the two boys. It was written in 1941. It told just a little bit about their lives, because all the letters went through a German censor, and if they said anything controversial, the letter never got posted. But it announced that Suzanne had died in the institution, and they said that she had died of an aneurysm, and that at last she was at peace and out of her heavy misery, were the words that they used. that letter left so many questions in my mind. That letter is one of the things that's prompted me to keep researching my aunt's life. Suzanne's story has become more accessible to me in recent years. I've been doing research with a historian in Germany, and also an Australian historian who has done a lot of work on the whole treatment of people with mental illness in Nazi Germany. He actually wrote his PhD on it, and he has shared a lot of material with me, and it's become incredibly interesting and useful. So I don't know all the circumstances of how my Aunt Suzanne was sent to a mental institution, but she was in, I think it was April of 1937. So the date is really important to me because in 1937, Jews could still get out of Germany. But once Suzanne was put into a mental institution, it really became impossible then for her parents to leave. So my dad and his brother did get out in 1939, before the outbreak of war. And, you know, my dad said that his parents and Suzanne didn't leave. He didn't mention to me that his sister had been put in a mental institution. One of Hitler's hang-ups, which he had just as well as his hang-up about Jews, was about people with mental illness or any sort of disability. And even before the outbreak of war, he had planned, as part of his plan of racial purity, to get rid of Germany's people with mental illnesses, with physical disabilities, with intellectual disabilities, and with chronic illnesses that couldn't be cured. And my Aunt Suzanne became caught up in that because she was diagnosed as a schizophrenic in 1937, and schizophrenics was the target group that Hitler most wanted to get rid of. He wanted to get rid of everybody with schizophrenia. He wanted to eradicate that particular mental illness from his population. And he believed that if they were all killed, they could make sure that schizophrenia did not become part of his master Aryan race. It didn't turn out to be true. There was a period of time after the war when they didn't have schizophrenics in German society, but now they have schizophrenics and people with other mental illnesses and other disabilities, etc. So she was interned in 1937, and what's known about those mental institutions is that they were massively, massively overpopulated. There were huge numbers of people for every bedroom, and there was no privacy, and they were pretty awful places. However, the Germans did not keep a record of their treatments that they supposedly gave to people to try and improve their health. That's not something that's ever been recorded. But what has been recorded were some of the ways that they got rid of people. And one of the things that I learnt from Dr. Darren O'Brien here in Queensland, who did his PhD on the treatment of people with mental illness, was that a lot of them were starved to death. That was considered a very cost-effective way of getting rid of people. But also they were experimented on for cheap ways of bumping people off. In 1941, they had the first gas chambers, which were much smaller than the gas chambers that they used later in the big concentration camps, but they were experimenting with this as a way of getting rid of large numbers of people in one go. And that is how my aunt died. My dad never knew that. What the Germans did at that stage was to pass each one of these people in front of a doctor before they were sent off to their gas chambers, and the doctor wrote down what he thought was a sensible and believable suggestion for their death. So my grandparents got a letter in 1941 from the institution that she'd been sent to saying that she had died of an embolism and died peacefully in her bed. So my grandparents were comforted by that, and that was the whole purpose of these letters, was that the parents would be comforted and not get agitated and start making lots of inquiries. I think that my grandparents probably accepted that the body wasn't going to be returned to them. It certainly wasn't. But so that has become a topic of great interest for me, and the fact that she died by gassing is of great interest for me, as you will see as I tell you about the way my grandparents died. So Suzanne died in 1941, at the end of March 1941, and my grandparents, Elise and Leon Feuerstein, died in April of 1942. My dad found out about their deaths because the Red Cross were permitted to send letters to the family of German Jews, and believe me, they knew where they were. The Germans kept track of absolutely everybody. So he got a letter in 1942 saying that both of his parents were dead, and giving a tiny bit of information about that death. So I'm not sure, I think it was in 1939, my grandparents were kicked out of their very nice apartment in Dresden and sent to a Jewish ghetto. That was one of the first steps that the Nazis did everywhere that they went, was to lock up Jews into overcrowded ghettos so that they would be very, very easy to round up when it came time to send them to their deaths. And they did that right throughout Poland. They rounded up Jews in Amsterdam, they rounded up Jews in Paris, and in the other parts of Europe they had maybe a little bit more comfortable camps for them, I'm not sure, but certainly in Poland the camps were absolutely horrendous. Those Jews were then sent, usually in cattle trucks on trains, to the place of their execution. My grandparents had been sent to a ghetto in Dresden. However, it was not particularly built as a ghetto. It was a group of apartments that were taken over by the Nazis, and they were crowded into the apartments, but they weren't quite as bad as some of the ghettos in other places. After Suzanne's death, my grandparents planned to leave Germany. They hoped to leave Germany. And they managed to buy tickets for a ship that was going to sail to the USA in September of 1942. They wrote that in the letter to my dad and his brother. However, of course, the Nazis read all the letters that go out. They know everything that's going on. In April 1942, the SS came and, banged very loudly on the door where they were staying, and came in and did a tour of the apartment that they were sharing with another family, and found some fish in the fridge. Now, by that stage, along with all the other very oppressive rules that that they had burdened the Jews of Germany with, there was a new one saying Jews could not eat fish. So my grandparents were very, very badly beaten up that night and told to get themselves ready, that they would be deported to Riga the next day. Riga is in Lithuania, and I believe that they were deporting people to Lithuania because there really wasn't any protest from the local people about the number of Jews that were being shot there. So my grandparents knew exactly what was coming, because quite a few of their relatives had already been deported to Lithuania, to Riga, and they were never heard from again. It was not possible to make contact with them again. And so my grandparents were pretty sure that they were going to be taken on an overcrowded train. A lot of these trips were done actually in cattle trucks on trains, where the people were just squeezed in, and they had nothing to eat or drink. There were no toilets. So you can imagine how foul these cattle trucks became during these long trips that were involved. They didn't want to go to Riga. They knew what was coming. So they decided that night, which was the 26th of April 1942, that they would commit suicide together. And they did. They sealed up the kitchen area of their apartment. I don't know where the other people were that night. Maybe they were already in bed. They lay on the floor and they turned on the gas stove, and they died by gassing themselves. And when my father did get a letter from the Red Cross, that was mentioned. He did know how they died. So I find it quite amazing, and just the fact that both my aunt and my grandparents died by gassing, although not in the same way. My aunt was completely involuntary in this process. Kind of strange and meaningful in some way. My dad was absolutely devastated to get the letter from the Red Cross to say that his parents were dead. He had truly always hoped and always believed that they would get out of Germany and they would be reunited. He and his brother and his parents would be reunited. So to get the letter sometime in 1942, I don't know how long it took to get to Australia, was truly, truly devastating for him. My dad was a really fine pianist, as I mentioned before, and after he was released from the internment camp, a lot of the young men took up an option which was to become volunteers in basically a working corps for the Australian Army. So the great irony was that he came as a prisoner of war and ended up in Australian Army uniform, and they had two main jobs. One was loading ammunition onto trains, and the other was to be fruit pickers, because so many of the Australian men were at war, and so just like now in 2022, there was we have a shortage of fruit pickers and they had a shortage of fruit pickers. And that was it was a very happy time for him. My dad loved the Australian people. He found them so much more open to him, open to all of the young men that came on the Dunera, friendly, and just, very accepting, and he loved that.